È arrivato?
Sì, sì, è arrivato.
Ok, ciao.
Ciao. Good evening. Lorenzo ci metti in...
Sei online.
Okay. Good evening. I'm Giorgio Bartolomucci. I'm the Secretary General of the Diplomacy Festival, and I will be moderating this afternoon. The terroristic attacks in France and in Saudi Arabia yesterday make this debate extremely and dramatically actual and urgent. The question we will debate today is how terrorism and counter-terrorism have been affected by the pandemic. During the first half of the 2020, there was an increase in terrorist activity in both Africa and in Iraq. But the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on terrorism and counter-terrorism is still far from clear. Probably we still have relatively limited understanding of the changes that have occurred and what they mean for counter-terrorism. But without any doubts, terrorists and security services alike have been forced to adapt. There are many questions to be answered. The first that comes to my mind are: extremists have been making effective use of the web and online connectivity for a number of years. Lockdowns around the world have obliged a larger number of people to stay at home. The major use of internet has increased the risk of online radicalization and recruitment to terrorism. More, some reports suggest that they have even masqueraded as healthcare providers, offering advice on hygiene, building quarantine centers, and enforcing lockdown. Is it true? Today, without our expert, we will try to understand whether the surge in online recruitment efforts has been successful and how badly counterterrorism activity and cooperation have been affected. We start this afternoon debate with Her Excellency Fayez Khoury, Ambassador of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in Italy and the US Rome-based agency. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics at Yarmouk University and a master's degree in public administration at Harvard Kennedy School. Mr. Khoury worked as a Consul General of Jordan in Erbil, Iraqi Kurdistan for 4 years from 2011 and 2015. He was Chief of Cabinet Ambassador at the Ministry of Foreign and Expatriate Affairs, and since few months he is Ambassador to Italy. But I think that his previous experience makes him very competent on our topic. Ambassador, in various countries in the Middle East, such as Iraq, there is already an increase in the frequency of attacks conducted by Daesh-affiliated cells. The same can be seen in Syria, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and in the Sahel area of Africa. Jordan and the Middle East countries, as all the world, is facing a social and economic fallout from the pandemic that may induce instability. Looking to the future, do you believe that rising poverty and unemployment may lead to potential increase of recruits by the terrorists? The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for hosting me with this group of esteemed speakers and for such an excellent topic to discuss. Straight answer to your question, definitely. Absolutely. The economic and social impact of COVID-19 on multiple countries, not only countries of the Middle East, is going to have a major impact on terrorism. You know, when you think about it, there are also some good things about the COVID-19. We started seeing less face-to-face. With lockdowns, you start seeing less face-to-face recruitment activities. You started seeing these big, massive operations going slower and smaller. But it's also creating more opportunities to Daesh and other organizations. Daesh has based much of its infiltration of the Middle East on multiple reasons. Definitely some of it was grievances, some of it whether political or social or even religious. and some of it was based on economic and social disparities. And if we look at the impact of COVID-19 across the board, economies are suffering. Smaller countries will suffer even worse. Countries that used to have problems before the pandemic are definitely going to suffer even further. Are the countries of the Middle East going to have a bigger fallout? I don't know yet, but talking about my country, Jordan is holding together. The pandemic is not at ease at all. It's hitting us hard, but definitely, I think we are going to need to work with the global community to minimize the impact of the COVID-19, but also to minimize the impact of the outcomes of the pandemic on increasing terrorism activity in the region and across. Jordan has always been at the forefront of fighting terrorism, and we've been involved in operations across the globe with all our allies, whether it is against Daesh or before that Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and everywhere. Our presence has always been marked, and I cannot but say that we continue to do this because we believe this is these extremist organizations do not represent Islam, and this is something that we very much feel committed to. Now, what will happen if the pandemic has a massive impact on economies? You will have unemployment, you will have impact on the educational system, you will have impact on the health systems, you will have more disparities in economies and communities, and you will have, as you said before and you asked a question, you will have more people in lockdowns, and now with even remote education, you will have more people online most of the time. And this is also creating a new platform that terrorist organizations are utilizing. They are using the internet to recruit, they are using the internet to spread their doctrine, they are sending it out to they are using the internet as a tool to perpetrate attacks. Through cyber attacks to different organizations and different institutions and multiple countries. So yes, there will be an economic fallout causing more opportunities because of disparities, but also the use of internet and technologies is providing them with further tools to have an impact over. Linking things together, this is a tangent, but I would like to bring in a small thing that we keep talking about in Jordan. When we talk about students leaving schools and youngsters without job opportunities and without any bright future, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Agency for Palestinian refugees that has been there for decades servicing refugees, Palestinian refugees in Jordan and other parts of the region, has been facing financial troubles for many years. But over the last couple of years, it has been massive. And this has been causing a lot of concern. You know, you can imagine having like 500,000 students in the Middle East going out in the street, not finding schools because it's not funded anymore. And with the already difficult economic situation, this means that you are having, you know, loads and loads of recruits, pools of recruits, very eligible recruits for terrorist organizations. So if this has been studied well, then it applies easily at other segments of the communities in the region. How are we going to deal with this? I think the only thing to do is to have more global cooperation. Now, if we look at the pandemic, the impact has gone across the board. Economies of global players and big players has also been impacted. And many of the countries are looking inwards. So assistance, whether it's economic, whether it's military, whether it's cooperation, even in security, is being somehow cut short. Countries look inward because they want to support their own economies first. The priority comes within your own people and your own country. So helping establishing security structures in some parts of the world, like Afghanistan and Iraq, and even in Syria and other parts of the region, as well as in the Sahel and other parts of Africa, gets impacted. Police collaboration is impacted. Military cooperation is impacted. Economic support and development assistance is impacted. So this is all leading to worsening conditions and to creating more fertile ground for terrorist organizations to act. So global collaboration is definitely a must, to collaborate in fighting the pandemic and collaborate in fighting conditions that would really give terrorist organizations more legal ground. Thank you very
Ambassador, thank you very much, because you were very clear and also you remained within your 8 minutes of talk. And you were talking about military cooperation. Now we have General Vincenzo Camporini, an Italian military that has a degree in international science and diplomatic science. He was from February 2008 till January 2011, the head of defense, Italian head of defense. He's now the vice president of the Istituto Affari Internazionali. General Camporini, due to the pandemic, we have heard that the lead inspector general report to the United States Congress on counter-terrorism reported that USA FREECOM implemented a stop movement to the operation in North, West, and East Africa. And 2 multinational exercises were canceled. Most security cooperation activities across the continent were paused. And in Iraq and Syria, due to the COVID pandemic, training of Iraqi security force was suspended. Well, despite this news, can you guarantee that the operational support from the coalition will continue on force protection, information sharing, and assisting local security forces working to combat ISIS?
Well, good evening, everybody. A special thanks to the ambassador, who has been extremely clear in a vision of what can happen, what is very likely to happen. And I will start my answer also from his remarks. First of all, I cannot guarantee anything. I am in retirement, and I have no authority whatsoever to take decisions on how to implement the cooperation which has been established some time ago. I can only imagine what can happen, and of course there is an attitude for inward looking, as the ambassador himself said, which in a way will induce our public opinion not to be so keen in supporting the activities which are being carried in areas of instability. So the point is, will our governments still be determined to continue the effort under the pressure of a public opinion which is more concerned, worried about the consequences of its pandemic, from the health point of view, from the economic point of view, from the institutional point of view? It's something which in a way will slow down any willingness to be effective and to be active in this field. The point is that this pandemic has completely changed all the landscape, and I try to put myself in the shoes of a terrorist leader. How can I exploit this situation? Do I have more opportunities? Do I have more risks? And I believe that we should be very careful about this type of thinking, because of course we are considering societies, we are considering communities which have been quite resilient in the initial wave of the pandemic. But this resilience is now getting, in a way, weaker, which means that a terrorist attack of a significant magnitude can be extremely effective from the psychological point of view, which is the scope of the terrorist. We can perceive now the reaction of what has happened in France in the last couple of weeks, which is, some years ago, of course, would have been considered, but not with such a sharp reaction. So in a way, a terrorist attack could be more effective in such a situation. But on the other side, the measures for controlling what's going on in the society, the lockdowns of different magnitude, of different size, which are being taken as a measure to control the pandemic, are in a way increasing difficulty to organize any type of attack. And this is something which has to be considered. Movements are less easy than in the past. We are locked down in our homes, so anyone who is going around trying to organize some terrorist attack would be more easily detected. So again, if I put myself in the shoes of a terrorist leader, I would see opportunities and difficulties which are originated by this pandemic. Another point which has been already underlined is the fact that the difficulties of life today, the economical difficulties, the jobless, the increasing jobless situation is in a way widening the pond where I can recruit some troops for my scopes. And this is a triviality, if I can say so, because it is natural. More people are in difficulty. More families are without any income. Poverty is spreading, and this is the ideal situation in which those who want to recruit new resources, new human resources for any type of political activity, well, it's an ideal situation for them. Therefore, I believe that the duty of our government is to do anything which is possible to make these difficulties less and less heavy. I see that some countries are in a better situation than others, but for sure, countries which were already in difficulty in the past would be in even greater difficulties, and this will offer them the possibilities to recruit people for what they want to do. And this can be used also for normal operations. We have learned, we have been told that even in an area like Nagorno-Karabakh, someone is sending troops which has been recruited in countries which are in a difficult economical situation, and this may make easier to increase the destabilization of these areas. All in all, just to not to exceed my time, I think that we will perceive a very difficult control of the situation of the stabilities in our areas with less resources because the resources are employed at home, resources which will be less available in order to project stability where stability has been put in danger. So my final answer to your question is that I perceive more difficulty for our countries to make concrete what has been done so far in areas like Iraq, like Afghanistan, and other areas of crisis.
Thank you very much, General. Please do not underestimate the value of your opinion. I know that they are very well taken in Italy and also abroad in the NATO and what else and everywhere else. So do not estimate what your opinion is about. I will pass now the floor to Alessandro Politi, that is a professor of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and intelligence at COE, and he is also the director of the NATO Defense College Foundation. Alessandro, there is a particular concern about the increase of violent attacks in Africa, as both ISIS and Al-Qaeda have been very active there. There are possible longer-term consequences of international support being withdrawn that allows groups such as ISIS to reassert control over the territories. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Giorgio. I think that the first thing that we have to take into account is something structural. The France-Afrique is gone. This, let us call it, special relationship between France and a number of sub-Saharan African countries is undergoing a severe crisis. And it is not surprising. It's simply because France hasn't any more the resources to continue that sort of relationship. It was already certified by the former Republican president Sarkozy. And now with Macron, we see the effects. It's very interesting that at least for a group of countries, the CFA is gone as a currency. I won't discuss if this is a sign of independence or not, because stabilizing an African currency on the euro has a certain advantage, but surely it is a political sign. This, together with the fragility of a number of countries, has facilitated a vast space of illegality, of uncontrolled areas in the Sahara. We have really to think, and this is something my foundation did with a number of conferences, that we have to reason not anymore just with the Mediterranean, but with two seas, one sea of water and the another sea of sand. And in this, the logic of the 7 pillars of Lawrence of Arabia is absolutely valid. The problem is that we are the Ottomans. And this is something that complicates a lot, what we do, how we do it. The other thing is that we, and the we is very to be taken, with some diplomatic grain of salt. We don't really know who are we. In Libya, this is blatant. There is a certain disunity among NATO allies, to say the least. So this vacuum, which has been in the past, I would like to remember that in the 90s, there was a very, efficient and a very professional American president who was also very much loved, Bill Clinton, talked about African Renaissance. But the Renaissance was surely, a rude hit to the post-colonial settlements and situations that Europeans had. The war, the genocide in Rwanda, Burundi, and the never-ending war in Congo, you can, interpret them as you like, but there were an ejection, by the way, also Somalia, by the way, of European powers that had a certain, control, say, influence. And this hasn't been substituted with another guarantee. It has been left in a sort of very fragile vacuum. And this is a problem. The best example was, of course, given with the so-called interventions in Syria and Libya, where nothing has been done afterwards. By the way, the Syrian intervention failed spectacularly if the objective was to overthrow the Assad family. So this is a situation where, of course, non-state actors, and here we have published right now on our website our Game Changers Dossier 2020, acquire structurally a very great influence. Why? Because governments are weak in many cases. Our academic literature calls them sometimes states, but this is wrong. A state is something with a sufficient structure to overcome internal divisions. Governments belong to somebody, and this is a very important distinction. So these governments are weak, and in these weak governments, of course, non-state actors have more space, no matter if they are legal or illegal. And by the way, I wouldn't just focus on terrorists, but also on organized criminal networks. And these networks don't care a fig about borders, not even the best guarded and best walled borders, you know. Mafias work happily, especially if there is a solid border with a lot of fortification. It's a bonus. It's not an obstacle. And the Sahel is, you know, a free roaming space for that sort of entities that, by the way, as we rediscover in southern Italy, and not only in southern Italy, provide a parallel welfare state that governments sometimes don't provide. i.e., that is the rub. We have one of the most important effects of the pandemic was that we reduced willy-nilly our energy consumptions. And we knew perfectly well that very few oil, I would say fossil energy providers are fiscally sound. Without energy, they just, you know, go in a deep dive. Venezuela is just the most spectacular example, but I would be worried to see how other countries, not just, you know, on the Gulf, would fare if, you know, this continued reduction in energy consumption coupled with low prices. And the prices have been depressed by shale oil and gas, which is absolutely in excess to the global demand. Well, this is a situation which is perfect for having troubles, of which terrorism is a component. And we know there are always the same 5 countries that are victims, you know, of real terrorism. In this situation, you know, instability is something even worse. So for that thing, I suspect we have, as NATO, you know, and I don't speak, of course, in official capacity, I'm just, you know, the director of a private foundation. But of course, we have, first of all, seriously to revive, revamp, and give more substance to our Mediterranean dialogue and to our Istanbul Cooperation Initiative that exists, that have legitimacy, very important, and that have the basis for a good cooperation. Of course, it is a menu that is decided by both parts, but this is exactly the success of that sort of structures. So we did something now with the pandemic, albeit a bit slowly, but we can do more. The rest is, of course, a lot of, if I may say, homework. You know, you can't pretend that the banlieues are places where things are happy. They are not. And this gives, of course, ground for recruitment, and it is already very reduced. If you see what is happening now in France, well, we are, luckily, and unfortunately for the few victims, a far cry from the 200 deaths of Atocha in Madrid. 200, not 17, 200, forgotten. And we are, of course, very far from what happens on the other side of the Mediterranean. Tunisia, Egypt, Any news from Sinai? Well, they are not good news. Occupied territories, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and we can span across the whole of Northern Africa, unfortunately. More or less severe, more or less controlled, but there are certain problems that are not only social, of course, they are political. And these are problems that need, a political approach. This is why NATO started to think, with a reflection group, the NATO 2030, to be more political and not just, a security provider, as it was and it is, with, a reasonable success, even accounting that Afghanistan was, well, more problematic.
Alessandro, thank you very much. And I think that we will have a lot of questions on what you have just expressed in general terms. I will give the floor now to Maurizio Caprara, that is an international politics columnist of the Corriere della Sera. He was advisor to the President of the Republic, Giorgio Napolitano, and director of the communication office of the Quirinale. He teaches ethics and ethics of journalism in the Master of the Higher School of Journalism at Lewis University. Maurizio, the increase in extremist rhetoric and messaging has led to an increased urban violence act in Italy and other countries of the world. Do you think that an extremistic groups are, as the extremistic groups are opportunistic, will they take full advantage and carry out violent and more terroristic attacks in Europe? Maurizio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Giorgio, and good evening to everybody. I think that there is a material on which they can work. From October until now, at least 26 countries had protests against the restrictions imposed by the COVID-19. And of course, these are feelings that can be useful to terrorist group, although we have not to confuse the protests with the terrorists. But they are that can be also a borderline in some cases, and I hope just in a few of them. I would answer to your question reasoning about the fragility of our societies in some way, and I have something to read for you. Listen to these words. All my suffering on this world has been at the hands of humanity, particularly human. It has made me realize just how brutal and twisted humanity is as a species. All I ever wanted was to fit in and live happy life amongst humanity, but I was cast out and rejected, forced to endure an existence of loneliness and insignificance, all because the female and the human species were incapable of seeing the value in me. This is not just the beginning of a long letter. These words belong to a document entitled My Twisted World, the Story of Elliot Rodger. The author, Elliot Rodger, was a 22 years old boy when police accused him of the deaths of 6 people near to University of California in Santa Barbara. So it's not Europe, but Western societies. 1,300 people were wounded. And reading again on the New York Times, the words that were used in that days, we can remember that he stabbed 3 men to death and shot the others as he methodically opened fire on bystanders on the crowded streets. It happened in a small town. Rodger was found dead with a bullet wound to his head, and he had in his car 3 semi-automatic handguns along with 41 loaded 10-round magazines, all bought legally at the local gun stores. The day before the massacre, Rodger posted a video on YouTube in which he described the isolation and sexual frustration of his life. And he told, "I do not know why you girls aren't attracted to me, but I will punish you all for it. On the social networks, he refers to himself as an incel, a short way to say involuntary celibate. On April 2018, a man called Alec Minyasin wrote a post on Facebook. He lived in Canada. The incel rebellion has already begun. All hail Supreme Gentleman Elliot Roger. Then Minyasin in Toronto killed, driving a van, by the way, 10 people, and in the same attack tried to kill other 13 people. It's easy to understand that Roger was a person with bad psychological problems, at least. And Minyasin, that was a 25 years old boy, was described on the New York Times as a socially troubled computer studies graduate. Every one of us knows that madness as violence is not a new phenomenon in the human history. The difference between ancient times and current times is the existence of these so-called social networks that were not existing in a digital way in the centuries before. There were social networks that were not unmaterial. There were human relationships with other forms and way of being developed. So we can notice that personal and social frustrations and violence itself, if they are blended with social networks, can give new kind of results. Just a detail, in November 2013, Reddit, which is a social network that maybe you know better than other Italians that don't use them, and is more used in the United States than in Italy, had banned a community dedicated to the incels, the same word that Roger used, which had around 40,000 members. And their posts were against women and also lauding the rape of women. Roger was a crazy kid? Probably, yes, I would say. But once he became a murderer and a dead one, he became also a leader, an example. Not just an isolated crazy boy, as maybe he would have been in the past. All these actions are not actions of a political terrorism, in the strict meaning of the expression, of course, but some of these actions are very close to some kinds of racist and extreme racist violent attacks of the recent 3 years around the world. Borderline with organized terrorism. I told that everything I said it was to assert that in times of pandemic, lockdowns, loss of jobs, economic crisis, intensive social pains, more people than before are potentially tools of terroristic dreams or terroristic organization. And I think we have to be aware that during this era of lockdowns or limitations, there is an apparently calm situation. Sometimes it's breaks in the news by some limited attack. But I think that all these social pain and individual pains are a fertilizer for the spread of terrorism. And if you remember, in 2011, when Osama bin Laden was killed, there was a general perception that the Islamic terrorism was something that was a matter of the past. 9/11, 2001, the end of Osama bin Laden. Then 3 years later, we had the Islamic State in Iraq. So we have to consider, we have not to live with the fear that everything is going in a terrible way, but we have to be aware of the fact that terrorist organizations are something that work in the dark, and not always we see in real time what they are doing or what they are imagined to do. So we have to consider about Europe, Giorgio has, about your questions, that one of the painful situation is now in France. And is in France for several reasons. The first one I would say is the lack of integration of a good integration of people coming originally for the ancient colonies of the France, and a bad situation in some of the banlieue with marginal, with people isolated in the crowd. I think that in our country, for the presence of the church and of a Catholic network, and also for the selection of the kind of migration that has been done by the families, when the part of the migration which is more recent than the one that in France they have, was filtrated by each family that had to choose the person for a job at home, for ancient parents, relatives, or kids and children and so on. And so we have a different situation. But another causes of the bad situation in France is that they have soldiers in Mali, and they had a military engagement in Syria that we had not. But at the same time, there is a perspective that make possible that we'll have more clashes between the a part of the French society and a part of the Muslim world. The President Macron will face in a year and a half, about a year and a half, new elections, and he needs to have the support of a part of the rightist electorate, and he is, in some cases, I think this is not a justification at all for every act of terrorism and bloody terrorism, such as the one that have been made in France, but he needs to be supported by rightists to avoid that this support will be just to Marine Le Pen. So I think that we will have apparently, looking at the possibility of new terrorist acts in France, but at the same time, we have not to forget that acting in the dark, terrorism can be painful also in other places.
Thank you very much, Maurizio. And from Europe, we'll move now to Middle East with Rebecca Mieli, that is connected with us from Jerusalem. She's an Italian-Israeli political and global security analyst, currently researcher at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, deputy director of the Middle East branch at Mediterranean Council and Forum. Rebecca, it has been said that where governments are already incapable or unwilling to provide effective services, extremist groups can continue with their societal support measures and take on new ones, further gaining trust and legitimacy. Hezbollah is an example. In response to COVID-19, Hezbollah announced its plans to provide healthcare through the hospitals and clinics it operates. Is this part of the wider war with their medical staff called Islamic resistance medics? Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and hope that you all hear me. Yeah, of course, jihadist groups around the world have framed COVID-19 as a geopolitical opportunity. Since the beginning of spread of COVID-19, Hezbollah and the Iranian regime have taken advantage of the crisis in order to indoctrinate operatives and Shiite public. The situation changed completely in August, and in the last days, Lebanon reached the brink of a complete economic collapse. The main reasons are, first of all, there are sanctions imposed by the United States on Hezbollah and Iran, of course. The COVID crisis is the second reason. The third reason, and most recently, the catastrophic explosion in the port of Beirut. It does not inflict financial costs, but also crush the famous Lebanese sense of resilience. Groups such as Hezbollah are certainly exploiting humanitarian vacuum to gain every day more power by increasing aid to population. Hezbollah made the healthcare a powerful weapon in Lebanon, and its supporters commonly stress out how successful the party has been at combating against COVID-19. Unfortunately, the explosion that destroyed the port in August opened the door to an unprecedented political and economic crisis that reflects the inability of all the political forces, including Hezbollah. After the new prime minister resigned only some days ago, the Saad Hariri, which was three-time PM, was renamed to create a cabinet that can lift the country out of its worst economic crisis in decades. Lebanon lost the third PM in less than a year. The instability in the shape of pandemic represents an opportunity to keep the status quo for Hezbollah. And at the same time, it is freezing the economy, causing mass protests. Recent figures from the World Bank shows that the poverty rate raised from 1/3 in 2018 to half of the population in 2020. In this context, the pandemic turned into a serious challenge for both the country and the terror organization too. COVID-19 didn't stop Hezbollah terror activities in the region. At the beginning, mainly until August, it also created an opportunity to use the failure of the state to build popular support. Hezbollah is perceived by the population as the cause of economic crisis right now. That's why Hezbollah tried to fill the void left by the states as an opportunity to show their governance capabilities. First of all, the first move Hezbollah did was appointed Safi al-Din, head of the Hezbollah Executive Council, and it's number 2 of the movement, to craft and implement the emergency plan and to respond to COVID-19. The move was released in March. During the first phase of the pandemic, Hezbollah allocated 1,500 doctors, 3,000 medics and nurses, 5,000 medical teams for hospital and clinics, and 15,000 field personnel. Also, it placed medical infrastructure at disposal of the fight against COVID-19, 23 diagnostic centers, and transformed a compound in South Lebanon into a quarantine center. And also, last but not least, it sent daily meals to people in quarantine for months. The current situation now is different because the explosion that devastated both Hezbollah credibility and the Lebanese capital in August is known to be caused by a large amount of ammonium nitrate in a building. And the blast was equivalent to about 240 tons of military explosive. That caused another health disaster in the area, with hospital almost collapsing due to the large number of injuries, plus the COVID patients. The person who currently is in charge of the port of Beirut is Wafik Safa, is the Hezbollah security chief and Nasrallah's brother-in-law. It's married to Nasrallah's sister. And it is also man designated by the US Department of Treasury as the head of Hezbollah security apparatus. So the citizens blame Hezbollah, and the terror organization is widely known for using ammonium nitrate for terror attack and threat. We have several examples. For example, Hassan Nasrallah threatened to strike Israel ammonium nitrate tanks located in Haifa. So he was perfectly aware on how dangerous could have been keeping tons of that material near a critical infrastructure. Then in 2019, we have the Daily Telegraph that revealed that the British intelligence found an alleged terrorist stockpiling more than 3 tons of ammonium nitrate in London. And we have more cases in Cyprus, in Kuwait. So we know that they use the nitrate of ammonium. Back to the pandemic, 2 days ago, Lebanon registered 1,800 new cases of coronavirus for the second consecutive day, and it's definitely a new record in a range of 24 hours. Lebanon has witnessed a 220% increase in coronavirus cases ever since the beginning. So the total number of infection has crossed 45,000 and more than 400 people died. Currently, hospitals are at their full capacity and patients will soon outnumber the beds. And in addition to these, all the efforts by Hezbollah to build the Islamic resistance medic, it seems like it's failing because many doctors and nurses who are paid in Lebanese pounds felt poorly compensated because the currency devaluated by 80% over the past year. So most of them are moving to other countries, and the popular discontent is growing day by day. So to give a conclusion or a scenario, I would say that for almost a decade, Hezbollah has been given a special status on the international stage, mainly because, unlike any other terror group, the Iran-backed group apologies naively differentiate between the group's military and the political wing. But with Lebanon on the verge of an economic and financial collapse, many countries in EU, from France to Germany, from UK to Czech Republic, are realizing that the so-called political wing of Hezbollah is just as dangerous and criminal as the militant wing. And after a decade of compromises, the status quo is coming to an end. For example, for the first time, the US Treasury sanctioned two Hezbollah officials, both members of the Hezbollah Central Council. And also, in the last days, Lebanon and Israel started the maritime talks. And it is more than evident that Lebanon government has its back against the wall. Even if Hezbollah still keep considerable power, it couldn't stop the government in holding negotiation with Israel. Beirut is admitting indirectly that the road to economic prosperity turns throughout the talks with the government of Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Matteo Colombo is an ISPI Associate Research Fellow in the MENA Center and European Council Foreign Relations Pan-European Union Fellow. His field of research is very interesting. He's studying social dynamics, social media, Judaism, and Arab politics. Matteo, do you think that disinformation during the COVID pandemic may help to fuel multiple narratives, making it difficult to isolate and address the sources of information that are just behind these extremist thoughts? Can you comment on the use of disinformation to fuel terrorism recruitment?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, actually, I think that we are, as the speakers before me outlined, at a very risky time because people are more exposed to propaganda. There is an economic crisis. There are a lot of reasons that are actually there. And when we look at the communication of this jihadist group in general, it's actually quite interesting to see how they are reacting to the news and how they are giving sense to what's going on. And I had a bit of a look in these days about it and was trying to get a bit some information from that. And I think that we can find three main themes that are there and are important to discuss. So an important premise is like when you are part of a terrorist organization, whatever is, you know, the ideological connotation of that, you kind of tend to see events as having a certain sense, right? You see that the history doesn't happen, you know, just as it is, but there is a teleology, there is a direction where history is going. I don't know, it's not even only for jihadists. If I'm like looking at, I don't know, white supremacist group, they might think that, I don't know, the Black Lives Matter protests are to be understood within a broader framework of, you know, for example, a state weakening and division between the groups that might lead this group actually to rise. So when we see at Islamic State and jihadist propaganda, we can find mainly three themes that are kind of repeated in their communication in these times of corona crisis. So the first one is that infidels, so West, China, Shia, of course, so Iran and so on, are fundamentally hostile to Islam, and they will do everything to weaken it. So that's kind of the beginning point of their discourse. The other one is that we are living in an extraordinary time, that we are like living in a time which is kind of going through the end of the day. So IS, for example, truly believe that we are going toward the apocalypse, for example, and you know that the last days are coming, and they are kind of the chosen group to actually win the final battle against the enemies of Islam. And the third one is that there is not a defeat, right? That even that if the group, for example, IS in Iraq and Syria has been defeated military, this is just an accident of the history, we could say, that the group will actually go on and will rise as strong as before. So bearing in mind these three ideas, so infidels are hostile toward Islam for religious reason, not for contingent reason. We are living in apocalyptic time, and there is no defeat because Islam and in their idea IS will win its three key points. We can actually understand how they are reacting to the current news on the pandemic, and we can understand how they are processing and then they are pursuing their propaganda on that. So the first one is like the pandemic is understood as something that didn't happen as an accident. That there is this expression which also arrived in the media that COVID has been like a soldier of Allah, in the sense that the pandemic arrived to weaken the enemy of Islam. So what's going on now is that like this kind of situation will make the state who oppose to the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or whatever weaker. So there is more possibility that the group will actually make a comeback and will rise again from its ashes. So this is an element that we can find in many propaganda material. Al-Naba is actually the one I'm referring to, where actually is defined as the divine words. So something that happened not as an accident, but it has a meaning. And there is also an interesting element of their interpretation that when there is a president or a political leader who had COVID, they actually, of course, interpret within this framework, right? The framework is like, this didn't happen as such. There is a reason why this person who is an enemy of Islam has been affected by COVID. And the other interesting element is when you have this kind of mindset, even if things happen which seems contrary to your point of view, you can still put within the framework you set. So when COVID cases started also within the sympathizer of IS or Al-Qaeda and so on, the discourse became like, yes, of course, this is like a pandemic sent by God in their own interpretation, but the enemy of Islam are actually using it to spread it in our rank, to weaken us. So whatever happens, if you have this kind of interpretation of history, will be interpreted within your worldview. And this is like, it's actually also studied in academia as confirmation bias, but if you are in a terrorist organization, you have it even stronger, even more. Everything happens for a reason. So the other thing that I was saying, which is a key element of the jihadist propaganda, is that we are living in an extraordinary time. Well, we have a pandemic. We have states losing GDP in a percentage that we didn't see since the Second World War. So it's very easy, if you are a terrorist organization, to interpret that as a confirmation that we are actually living in the end of the days where all this disruption happens. And then, in their view, Islam will actually finally prevail. And the third point is actually very interesting if we interpret the fact that IS was defeated in a certain sense military. So if we are like facing a situation like the one we have now, that give an argument for this kind of groups to say, actually, we were not defeated for real, right? These things will happen to allow us to come back to, start our operation. So we have a lot of communication about, for example, attacks and so on, which point exactly at this point. So, what you might have our enemy interpreted as a defeat is actually not a defeat. It's just, a moment that happened because there would be this moment where we could actually come back and be stronger than before. And going to the conclusion, it's actually interesting to see that Al-Qaeda implemented more or less the same topic I said, but they actually have a more broader message. So they say not only that, these things happen for the reason I enumerated, but also that there is the opportunity for the Ummah, for the Islamic community to actually unite again and face this difficult time. So if we have all these into consideration, I just take the last minutes and we want to sketch some policy, because actually the topic today was about counterterrorism. Well, there are three things that are very important, I would say. So the first one is that we have to keep things monitored, right? Because we are facing a moment when we saw with Nice, we kind of sometimes forget that a military defeat doesn't mean the end of an ideology. We see with very old ideology that still today people support, despite organization perhaps expired even 70, 80 years ago. So normally ideology live a lot longer than the organization. Let's think about Nazism, for example. There are still people who believe in that, despite it has been defeated many, many years ago. So the second one, and this is to me very important, is that it is okay to be very harsh on jihadism, even to criticize Islamism in its political form, but it is always important to counter the narrative of the war against Islam. And this is very important for political leaders, that what we are criticizing is this particular group, not the religion itself. And the group is political. I made the comparison with the supremacist group at the beginning to show that terrorist groups have some similarities in a way, despite sharing very different ideology. And the third one, and then I'm finishing, is actually that we actually have a competitive advance compared to a few years ago. Because the group has been defeated, we had people who lived under the role of IS, of Al-Qaeda, and so on. So they can speak for themselves. They can say in their word how bad it was to be under their rule. And this is a competitive advantage we didn't have before. So if we want to have a successful counter-narrative, it's very good to give word to these people who live there. Because if I'm saying it, of course, I'm not a person who experienced it personally. But if a person who lived there and experienced that personally, of course, it makes a huge difference. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And now the last speaker is Marco Dilido, that is a senior analyst, head of Africa desk at the Centro Studi Internazionali in Roma, CESI. Marco, the impact of the pandemic on terrorist activity is likely to vary according to circumstances. Do you agree that both the short and long-term risk of terrorism has increased? The floor is yours.
Yes, of course I do, because as many other social and economical and political factors, also COVID-19, with its impact, it's destined to be a force multiplier for radicalization and terrorist activities. The problem is to understand how it will affect jihadist activities in the short term and how it will affect them in the long term. But basically, it doesn't come from the pandemic itself. It doesn't come from how many months we should wait before to have a cure or to have the vaccine. The problem is that how high will be the price and will be the cost of the pandemic in terms of social, economical, and political impacts. So in the short term, what we are looking at, what we are seeing, that the terrorist organizations are exploiting fear and are exploiting social grievances of local communities towards the government. If we look at Africa, for example, jihadist organization, as Dr. Colombo just said before, they built actually a kind of narrative that drove the COVID-19 as a God punishment for the infidels. And in certain part of the Sahel, just like the Tillabéri region of Niger, they explicitly asks to believers to counter government decision in terms of mitigation measures. If I can make an example, the government of Niger tried to forbid collective prayers, but to try to stop the diffusion of the virus. And ISIS, both ISIS and Al-Qaeda just say, don't listen to them because they are not a true government and a government of believers. So please continue to make collective prayers because only Allah can save us from the virus. So in the short term, the most important impact can be on propaganda. They can use the virus and they can use the fear linked to the virus to have new recruits and both to push potential lone wolf to act. Because we don't have to underestimate the psychological impact of lockdown or losing a job or staying a lot of days and weeks without the possibility of meet friends of our beloved people. This can impact the psychological profile of many people and can become a trigger that can help or enhance radicalization. So this, in the short term, the propagandistic and propaganda risk can be very, very high. But if you look at Africa and the impact in the short term of the pandemic, jihadist organization just accomplished several results. Let's make an example. In Mali, mitigation measures and lockdown measures, shutdown measures impacted the local labor market, especially agricultural activities. In Mali, 70% of the workforce is employed in first sector activities. During the lockdown, they lost their job and they lost their first source of income. So we have a lot of people that actually have no money, have no food, have no resources to live. In a scenario, in a framework just like the Malian one, in which the government is not able to provide sufficient help to these vulnerable communities. So this vacuum, this anger of local community is taken by jihadist propaganda and by jihadist activities. In certain ways, even the coup d'etat in Mali was triggered by a social discontent that comes both from the disaffection toward the President Keita and from social insecurity linked to unemployment and poverty after the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. In the long term, we just have to evaluate how the impact in the social level and in the economic level will evolve. Of course, a population in which social and economical insecurity just became more and more tougher is a society very vulnerable to radicalization, to jihadist radicalization, but also to far right or far left radicalization. We don't have to think only about Africa or Middle East or only about jihadist violent extremism as a threat for the future. We must be brave and we must don't underestimate the domestic risk and what can happen in Italy and in Europe with far-right groups and far-left groups. What we are looking at in Italy in the last weeks, so this public anger demonstration in the streets and in the squares are something that can be exploited by far-right, and actually both in Naples and in Rome and in Turin, with the crowd, there was a huge presence of far-right group like Forza Nova and others. There is something that we have to look at, because as history teaches us, radicalization grows very fast and very strong where society is weak, when people is full of fear for their social and economical condition.
Okay, Marco. I don't want to stop you, but I would like to give the floor to the students and for some questions. They surely will ask you something about this, and you can take the floor again. But before we go to the students, okay. Ambassador Khoury, do you have a short comment, and then we'll go to the students?
Yes, actually, the whole angles of this topic were clearly covered by the speakers. The very interesting point that everybody needs to take into consideration also, that there is an intertwined relationship between organized crime and extremist organization, because it's beneficial for both parties. And this has been probably clearly identified during the pandemic, because both parties needed new clients and new partners because of the situation. And this has to be a new topic looked at by researchers, as it is, I'm confident, looked at by law enforcement organizations and security apparatus. Other than that, I think everything was covered well, and we're ready to answer any questions by the students.
Okay. The students, if they want to do a question, they have to raise their hand. In the meantime, I pick up one question from the social that says, why did not the intelligence force in France prevented this type of attack? Who is able to answer to this question? Maybe
It's
Alessandro
very easy.
As you like, you know.
Just one second. One at a time. One at a time. One at a time.
Yeah, please choose you. Who starts? Okay.
Alessandro.
When you see the numbers, you know, you have one person, 2, 3, 10, 20. It depends from the weapon. With a knife, you can't do very much. And even with a truck, well, it depends from the situation. And with a fire weapon, you can do more. But it is very, very difficult. Even if you already follow that person, if you have it already, you know, in your files, it's you have so many people to follow and so few people to treat those files and these persons. You know, it's not just following a file. You have to make surveillance, and this can be automated up to a certain limit. Or you must be, you know, you must have a very pervasive state, like in the GDR. Well, then
Okay, Alexander. Mulik Karman has a question. Please, Mulik.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes.
Okay, lovely. My name is Arman Mulic, and I'm a second-year student of global governance. Massive thanks to all the panelists, especially for mentioning the technological aspect of the issue, since we're currently witnessing its importance, with the mass digital surveillance allowing population-wide contact tracing that we find quite useful. Of course, this requires an invasive digital monitoring. And in some states, I know that they've included the use of cell phone data previously collected for counter-terrorism purposes, now repurposed to monitor individual travel movements. Therefore, I'd like to ask about some of the potential dangers, but also opportunities in using these technologies at a global level, and also in the direction in the development that you would like to see in the post-COVID period. Yeah, thank you very much.
Let's collect another question. Giovanni D'Agostino and then Walter Moore. Giovanni D'Agostino, is yours.
Good evening. I hope you can hear me. Thanks to all the panelists. It was a very amazing conversation, so inspiring, so insightful. My name is Giovanni D'Agostino, a global governance student from the second year. Dr. Caprara mentioned some examples that are rarely labeled as terrorist attacks by the masses, but rather isolated actions of mentally challenged individuals. And yet they're indeed terrorist attacks, but often fail to be labeled as such because, let's face it, they're carried out by Christian white people. And that's how masses think. In other words, what Westerners conceive as terrorism must be connected to a specific religion, Islam, and a specific origin, Northern Africa or Middle East. This brings me to the question, how do we help the public opinion draw the line between religious beliefs and terrorist attacks?
Okay, who is answering? Maurizio Caprara, do you want to answer?
Sometimes the line can be thin, but what I would like to stress is that the fragility of our society is a danger before the terrorist attack, and that is there is a particular condition. We can also remember in our history, in the Italian history, we hadn't terrorist attacked during the worst economic era of our country. We had it in the 70s, in which there were an economic crisis, surely in the second part of the 70s, starting from the 76, 77. But there was a delusion of some generations, new generations, that had the opportunity to study that was impossible for their parents, for example, or for part of them. And this frustration was not the only cause, of course, but was one of the motivation of a psychological damage to the society that make possible for organizers of terrorist group to work in a fertile scenario. So I think that we have not to underestimate absolutely rightist terrorist attack that we have seen in the United States, we have seen in New Zealand, we have seen in Scandinavian countries. I hope we are not so touched by this phenomenon, but we cannot underestimate it. And the distance between religions and attack, it can be also very, very large, because first of all, we can be aware of the fact that Islamistic fundamentalist terrorism is against other Islamic people, and is not just the worst thing we can do is to generalize and to make the gift to the Islamic fundamentalist terrorists to join them with all the Islamic world and to associate them also to all the fundamentalism, because we have to recognize that also Saudi Arabia, for example, it can be fundamentalistic as a conception of the religion, the Saudi Arabia regime, but we can't say that they are the origins of the terrorist attacks away. So I think that your question is important, and the first thing you have to do when you have to fight an enemy is to divide him from other potential supporters.
Okay, question from Walter Moore, and then Faizul Heva Mukabat. Walter, please just try to be quick in the question so we will have more answers.
Okay, no problem. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Mo Walter. I'm a global governance student from Israel. And actually my question can be
Connection is not good. Connection is not good. The connection is not good, Walter.
Really?
Now we cannot understand.
On Hezbollah.
Well, I'll pass to Faizuleva Mukabat because your question was not heard.
Okay, sorry. I asked Ms. Rebecca Mieli about the prevention of the strong influence of Iran over Hezbollah in the recent talks between Israel and Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid I didn't understand the first part of the question because of a problem of the connection. So if you just can repeat like only the first sentence, it would be great for me.
Okay, just I'll try to make it short as possible. Just trying to understand how Israel can prevent the influence of Iran in Hezbollah and Israel talk now with Lebanon and all this dramatic change, since we don't want Iran to come closer to our borders. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So yes, as you probably know, Iran is building a sort of Shiite corridor from Tehran towards the Mediterranean. Of course, Israel is most of worried about the situation, and yes, all the talks between now Israel and all the Sunni countries of the Gulf are okay. The main aim it's not political, of course, it's economical, as you probably know. But of course, countering the Iranian influence in the region is one of the most important things related to it. And of course, if Hezbollah is suffering so much from the sanctions, and of course from the sanction also directed to Iran, because we know that United States with the sanction are also targeting both Iran and Hezbollah. So probably if Hezbollah wants to keep a sort of credibility and wants to keep hands on Lebanon, should probably accept the talks between Lebanon and Israel. It's quite mandatory because now there are two blocks. We know that there is the Sunni and the Shia blocks, but after all the crisis with the pandemic and this radicalization of Iranian how can I say, a radicalization of Iranian militants, we can say that now the priority of the states is to keep the feet on the ground. So it's very important for Lebanon to accept this and for Hezbollah to accept this.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. And we go to Faizulleva Mukabat.
Good evening. My name is Faizulleva Mukabat. I'm from Jiu-Jitsu. And I just need to tell that the recent events, which happened in France, made me feel really sad. And my question is that we know that after the speech of the French president of Macron, it caused like very provocative reactions. Some people approved it, some people were against it, and even the number of countries, there was the worsening in the relationship of the Islamic countries with the France. And right now, the thing that makes me feel anxious, not anxious, which worries me, is that one day, we know that there was the number of the terroristic attacks after this event. And I'm afraid that one day, like...
Make a question, Faizulla.
Yeah. So I'm coming to the question. So it might like explode. So my question is, what can be done in the current situation to just diminish this Prussian, maybe between this Islamic minorities? I don't know. I just don't know how to explain it. Between the religious minorities, for whom it was like a reason, for whom it was like the recent speech of the Macron was just a reason for another terroristic attack. Like just to diminish the scale of this tension.
Okay. Who is answering to Faizulleva?
Ready, if you want.
Bye.
Okay. I was struck after the speech of President Macron. I live in a very multi-ethnic part of Rome, the most multi-ethnic. So a lot of people from, almost every corner of the world, a lot of Muslims. And I had just, one of my friends, a shopkeeper near me, who said, hello, have you heard, it's so insulting. It's bad. His English was broken, but the message was very clear. Now, the first thing, and this is very important, is that people should be professionals. So first, don't tweet, do. And secondly, watch what you say. We had already a serious crisis with an economic boycott with Denmark on the so-called Islamic cartoons. And it was very ineptly handled because it was not just a matter of religion, it was a matter of politics. It is quite interesting to see that Turkey, who is already experiencing economic boycotts in several Arab countries, moved clearly, to fill for a short term this sort of vacuum. So I think that the first thing is political leaders should think what they say and shouldn't use generalizations that are problematic for their own interest. In this sense, all the religious dialogue that has been carried by different parties, also by, the Vatican, is a very important basis to de-escalate that sort of tensions, because they start with loose words, and this is not a good thing, because loose words then favor right-wing xenophobic parties.
Alexander, I have a question coming from the social for the Ambassador Khoury. Ambassador, what is the position of Jordan regarding the Abraham negotiation, the Abraham Treaty? And do you think that the relation between Israel and some Arabian countries will help in this cooperation, counter-terroristic cooperation?
Well, I would say Jordan has been always calling for peace and for a peaceful and just settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli cause. Over the years, we've been always calling for that, and we look forward for the day when we have a final settlement accepted by all parties and deals with the rights of all parties, and comes to the point where we'll see a two-state solution implemented on the ground, a Palestinian state that is livable, that is free, that is safe, living side by side in safety and harmony with Israel, with Jerusalem as East Jerusalem as its capital. So we have been calling always for peace, because it's not just a mythical ideal, because we need it. This is probably takes me to the question before that about the understanding different cultures, different civilizations, different religions, and sensitivity is taken by Islam or Christianity or Judaism about the religious figures of any of the three. What can be done is a great question. We can simply start by educating ourselves about other religions and about other cultures. We need to start talking to each other and make sure that we don't leave the grounds or the floor or the battlefield for fanatics from all parties. So we have to talk to each other and start understanding each other in order to overcome these differences and overcome these problems that we keep facing every now and then.
Thank you. I have two questions more, and then we have to close. The first is for Maurizio Caprara, and it asks if there is not a responsibility in the media that have created now this new sentence, low-cost terrorism. And I read the second one to Generale Camporini. The risk of increasing in this terroristic attack, this possible growth of attacks, is it possible that the government will use military force in trying to avoid these attacks, and this is also having an effect on our democracy? Maurizio, prima.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Of course, media has a lot of responsibilities in everything is going on in the societies, but and also precious qualities. But I would say that if responsibilities there are, the first are the one of the social networks and the use of social networks in some cases. I mean, of course, and I used to say, while the terrorist attacks were going on in France in the last years, we have to remember that we have resilience in the societies. And of course, old media didn't remember this to our society in the last years. And at the same time, the speed and the, I would say, nervous system of these times is in the main part derivated by the in real time communication and social networks too. So I recognize that the question is very important. So it's important that journalists be aware of their responsibility. I wouldn't give them all the faults.
Thank you. And General Camporini, the militarization of the security against terrorism may have some may create some problem to democracy.
Well, I'm talking about Italy, my country, because I know it, but what I say can be extended to all the Western communities, because we have such a long tradition since the end of World War II. The armed forces have always been very respectful of their role. Therefore, I do not believe that there is any risk of deviation from this point of view. Of course, the civilian authorities, the political authorities, may find themselves in a situation of scarce resources to combat the challenges, including terrorism, and may think of using the armed forces. But this will be done always in support of the civilian authorities, in support of the civilian police, in the support of the civilian intelligence system. I cannot perceive any temptation to militarize the societies. It's only a matter of using the manpower which is available, manpower which is very well qualified, very well trained, but only as those who execute the decisions of the civilian authorities. So I have no fear whatsoever about such a risk.
Okay, thank you very much, General. I want to thank all of you, Ambassador Cui, and all of the speakers, and also all the students that have been following all these different approach to the problem. And I also want to take the opportunity, this is the last event of the 11th edition of the Diplomacy Festival. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank all the people that has connected during these 10 days of work. It has been a very, very difficult edition because we had to move all the meetings that were supposed to be organized in a special setting of the town. We had to move it on the internet, and I hope that you enjoyed it, and I look forward for the next edition next October, hopefully again in Presencia. Thank you very much to all of you, and have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye
Goodbye.
bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Everybody. Have a nice evening. Bye.